So, this actually happened 6 years ago, but I'm finally ready to talk about it because the whole thing just came full circle and you guys are going to lose your minds when I tell you how this ended. But first, let me set the scene because the level of betrayal here is just unreal. I was married to Cheryl for 8 years. We had my daughter Sky, who was 8 at the time, and I thought we were just going through a rough patch like most couples do. I was working at a warehouse, making barely above minimum wage while trying to finish my business degree at night. But I figured we were building something together. Cheryl always complained that I wasn't ambitious enough, that her brother Nolan was already managing his own department at some tech company while I was still loading trucks. She'd compare us constantly, and it drove me crazy. But I kept thinking she'd see my potential eventually. What I didn't know was that Cheryl had been talking to my own family behind my back for months. My parents never thought I was good enough for her anyway. They always loved Nolan more than me. Always talked about how he had his life together while I was still figuring things out. Turns out they'd been having these little family meetings about how I was dragging everyone down and Cheryl deserved better. So, Christmas morning comes around and we're all gathered at my parents' house like usual. Sky is opening presents. Everyone's acting normal. And then Cheryl pulls out this perfectly wrapped box and hands it to me with this weird smile. She tells me it's my special present and everyone should watch me open it. I'm thinking maybe she got me something nice for once, you know? I unwrap it and there's a manila folder inside. I open it up and it's divorce papers completely filled out just waiting for my signature. But that's not even the worst part. Before I can even process what I'm looking at, Cheryl starts this whole speech about how she's done pretending to be happy with a man who has no drive, no ambition, and no future. She tells me she's been seeing Nolan for 6 months, and they're moving in together because he's what a real man looks like. That's when Nolan stands up from behind the Christmas tree where he'd apparently been hiding like some kind of psychopath. He walks over and puts his arm around my wife and tells me he's sorry, but Cheryl deserves someone who can actually provide for her and Sky. He calls me a minimum wage loser right there in front of my daughter. But wait, it gets worse. My parents start clapping. My own mother tells me they've been hoping Cheryl would finally leave me for years because I was never going to amount to anything. My dad chimes in about how embarrassing it's been having a son who can't even support his own family properly. Then little Sky, my 8-year-old daughter, who I'd been raising as my own, looks at me and laughs. She tells me Mommy already explained that I'm not her real dad anyway, so it doesn't matter if I leave. The cherry on top was Olivia, Cheryl's mother, pulling out her phone and recording the whole thing. She's talking about how this is going viral, calling it the biggest loser getting dumped on Christmas like this is some kind of entertainment. Here's the thing. While everyone is laughing and celebrating my humiliation, I just sat there and smiled. I signed those papers right there on the spot without saying a word. Then I looked around the room at all of them and said very calmly that they'd all regret this by New Year's. They thought that was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. Nolan especially was cracking up, asking what exactly I was going to do about it. My parents were shaking their heads like I was delusional for thinking I had any power in this situation. The truth is, I'd been preparing for something like this for 2 years. Not the Christmas ambush specifically, but I knew Cheryl was unhappy, and I'd been watching her phone, her behavior, everything. I suspected she was cheating, but I needed to be sure. More importantly, I needed to be ready. See, while everyone thought I was just some loser warehouse worker, I'd been building something much bigger. That business degree wasn't just for show. And my minimum wage job gave me access to information that none of them realized was valuable. I'd been documenting things, making connections, and setting up what you might call insurance policies. But I kept my mouth shut that Christmas morning. I packed my stuff that same day and moved into a studio apartment across town. For 6 days I waited. I knew exactly what was going to happen and when. December 31st at 11:47 p.m., my phone started buzzing nonstop. Text after text, call after call, Nolan, Cheryl, my parents, even Olivia. All of them freaking out and begging me to call them back immediately. The first message from Nolan just said, "Dude, what did you do?" Followed by about 15 question marks. Cheryl's messages were even better. She was practically begging, saying it was all a mistake and they needed to talk right now. I turned my phone off and went to bed. Let them sweat it out for New Year's Day. Tomorrow, I'll tell you guys exactly what I'd been planning and why they were all panicking. Trust me, this is just the beginning. Update 1. Holy crap, you guys. The response to my first post has been insane. Some of you are asking what exactly I did to make them all panic. And trust me, I've been waiting 6 years to tell this story properly. So, let me back up and explain what I'd actually been doing during those 2 years while everyone thought I was just some pathetic warehouse worker with no ambition. First thing you need to understand is why they all treated me like garbage. My parents had Nolan when they were in their early 20s, young and broke. By the time I came along 5 years later, they'd figured their lives out and had expectations. Nolan was always the golden child who met every milestone perfectly. College at 18, good job at 22, promoted to management by 25. I was the accident who struggled in school, took longer to find my direction, and didn't fit their timeline. Cheryl married me because I was safe and available. But she never stopped comparing me to Nolan. Every family gathering, every conversation somehow circled back to how well Nolan was doing and how I needed to step up. She'd make these comments about how embarrassing it was when her friends asked what her husband did for work. The worst part was watching her light up whenever Nolan was around, laughing at his jokes, asking about his projects, treating him like he was this fascinating person while barely acknowledging my existence. But here's what none of them knew. That warehouse job I was supposedly stuck in, it was owned by a logistics company that handled supply chain management for half the businesses in our area, including the tech company where Nolan worked as a department manager, including the medical practice where Cheryl worked as a receptionist, including the small business where my parents had been running their accounting firm for 15 years. While I was loading trucks and taking night classes, I was also paying attention, learning how businesses operated, who their suppliers were, what their contracts looked like, when their payment schedules ran. Most importantly, I was building relationships with people who had access to information. The business degree wasn't just for show either. I'd been taking courses in supply chain management, business law, and financial planning. Not because I loved learning, but because I knew eventually I'd need leverage. 2 years before that Christmas disaster, I'd started noticing Cheryl getting texts at weird hours. She'd smile at her phone during dinner, take calls in the bathroom, suddenly have plans that didn't include me. When I confronted her about it, she told me I was being paranoid and possessive. Said maybe if I paid more attention to improving myself instead of spying on her, she wouldn't need to find conversation elsewhere. That's when I started documenting patterns. Not like some stalker, but like someone who knew he was about to get screwed over and needed to be ready. I started noticing Nolan showing up to family events where Cheryl would be there, but I had to work. Started seeing them in the same social media post from mutual friends. Started realizing that all those family meetings my parents kept having about my future somehow always included Cheryl but never included me. But the real breakthrough came 8 months before Christmas. I was doing inventory at the warehouse when I noticed something weird about one of our client accounts. The tech company where Nolan worked was ordering way more equipment than they should need for their size, like tens of thousands of dollars worth of electronics and computer parts every quarter. But their employee count hadn't grown. So I started digging. Turns out Nolan had been inflating purchase orders and routing extra inventory to a storage unit he'd rented under a fake business name. He was planning to resell everything once he had enough stockpiled. The perfect crime, except he was using company purchasing systems that left digital trails everywhere. The genius part of his plan was how he'd set it up. He'd been gradually increasing order quantities over months, nothing dramatic enough to trigger automatic reviews, a few extra laptops here, some additional networking equipment there, always within the range of normal business growth. He'd even created fake project justifications in the system, complete with made-up client requirements and projected expansion plans. But here's where Nolan's arrogance worked against him. He couldn't resist bragging about his business expertise during family dinners. He'd talk about inventory management strategies, discuss supply chain optimization, explain how smart purchasing could make or break a company's profits. Everyone would nod along like he was some kind of genius while I sat there realizing he was basically confessing to fraud. The storage unit was registered under ProTech Solutions, a fake business name he'd created using Cheryl as his business partner. I found the registration documents when I was helping my parents organize their tax files. They'd mentioned doing some consulting work for Cheryl and needed the paperwork. Seeing her name on those incorporation documents was like getting punched in the gut, but it also gave me the missing piece I needed. I spent months documenting everything. Screenshots, order confirmations, delivery schedules, storage unit rental agreements. I even found the fake business registration he'd filed using Cheryl's maiden name as a partner. They were planning to launch their little side business once they had enough startup inventory stolen from his employer. The deeper I dug, the more elaborate their scheme became. Cheryl had been using her position at the medical practice to network with potential clients for their future business. She'd been collecting contact information from pharmaceutical companies and medical device suppliers who came through the office, building what she thought was going to be their customer base. She'd even started taking online courses in business administration, supposedly to support our household, but really to prepare for her new life with Nolan. My parents weren't just innocent bystanders either. They'd been helping Nolan structure his fake business to minimize tax liability once he started selling the stolen inventory. They'd set up accounting systems, advised him on business licensing requirements, even helped him apply for a business credit line using fabricated revenue projections, all while treating me like I was too incompetent to understand basic financial planning. The whole family had basically been planning my replacement for months. Every conversation about my future, every piece of advice about getting my life together, every suggestion that I wasn't living up to my potential, it was all designed to make me feel like the problem while they worked together to cut me out entirely. But I didn't turn them in. Not yet. I needed them to commit fully first. Instead, I spent those months setting up my own contingencies. I incorporated my own consulting business and started building relationships with their suppliers. I learned exactly how their purchasing systems worked and who the key decision makers were. Most importantly, I figured out the timing of their plan. The consulting business wasn't just a cover. It was my nuclear option. Through my warehouse connections, I'd started doing legitimate inventory optimization work for several companies in the area. Small projects at first, but each one taught me more about how businesses tracked their assets and where the vulnerabilities were. More importantly, it gave me credibility when I started reaching out to larger companies about security concerns in their supply chains. I'd been methodically building relationships with purchasing managers, compliance officers, and internal auditors across multiple companies for over a year. Not because I was planning some elaborate revenge fantasy, but because I knew eventually I'd need allies when everything fell apart. These weren't random people. They were professionals who had seen inventory theft before and understood how much damage it could do to a company's reputation. The beautiful part was that Nolan had no idea how interconnected the business community really was in our area. He thought he was operating in isolation, but every company he was stealing from had relationships with companies I was consulting for. Every system he was exploiting had counterparts in businesses where I'd been advising on security improvements. While he was busy stealing inventory and planning his future with my wife, I was building a network of people who would be very interested to know about his activities. People who had the authority to do something about it and the professional obligation to protect their companies from exactly this kind of fraud. They were waiting until after Christmas to make their move. Nolan was going to quit his job in January and claim he was starting his own tech consulting firm. Cheryl was going to divorce me and move in with him, using the profits from their stolen inventory to fund their new life together. My parents had agreed to help them get started by doing their business accounting for free. That's why they picked Christmas morning for their little ambush. They thought it was hilarious timing. Get rid of the dead-weight husband right before starting their exciting new adventure together. What they didn't realize was that I'd been feeding information to Nolan's employer for months. Not directly, but through consulting work I'd been doing with their parent company, small suggestions about inventory control, recommendations for audit procedures, casual mentions of security concerns I'd noticed in the industry. By December, they'd already started implementing new tracking systems. They just hadn't told their department managers yet. December 31st was the day Nolan tried to execute the final phase of his inventory transfer, except when he showed up at the storage unit, company security was waiting for him along with law enforcement, along with auditors who'd been tracking every fraudulent purchase order he'd submitted for the past 2 years. That's when my phone started exploding with messages because suddenly they all realized that the pathetic minimum wage loser they just humiliated on Christmas might have had something to do with their entire plan falling apart. But that was just the beginning. Tomorrow I'll tell you about the conversations I had with each of them over the next few days and how I made it very clear that their problems were just getting started. Update 2. Okay, so you guys have been blowing up my inbox asking for the details of those conversations. Trust me, this is where it gets really satisfying because each one of them tried a different approach to fix what they thought was just a misunderstanding. January 1st, I finally turned my phone back on and had 247 missed calls and texts. I decided to handle them in order of how much they'd betrayed me, starting with Nolan. He called me within 5 minutes of my phone coming back online. The conversation was exactly what I'd been preparing for. He starts off trying to sound casual, asking where I've been, and if I saw the crazy mix-up that happened at his storage unit. He tells me some security company made a mistake and thought he was stealing from his employer. But obviously, that's ridiculous because why would he risk his career over some equipment? I let him talk for about 10 minutes, just listening to him dig his own grave deeper. He's explaining how this is all just paperwork confusion, how the police obviously didn't understand business operations, how his company's inventory system must have glitched. The whole time he's fishing for information, asking if I might know anything about how this happened since I work in logistics. The desperation in his voice was incredible. This is the same guy who'd been calling me a minimum wage loser for years. And now he's practically begging me for help because he thinks I might have connections that could save him. He kept talking about how family should stick together during difficult times, conveniently forgetting how he'd literally hidden behind a Christmas tree to ambush me just a week earlier. What really got me was how he kept trying to minimize what he'd done. He called it inventory management errors and administrative oversights, like stealing tens of thousands of dollars worth of equipment was just a bookkeeping mistake. He actually tried to convince me that he was doing his company a favor by identifying security vulnerabilities in their purchasing system. That's when I told him I knew exactly how it happened because I'd been documenting his theft for 8 months. The silence on his end was beautiful. Then he tried to get aggressive, asking what kind of sick game I was playing and demanding to know what I thought I was doing to his life. So, I explained it to him very carefully. I told him about every screenshot I'd taken, every delivery record I'd copied, every fake purchase order I'd traced back to his login credentials. I explained how I'd been sharing security concerns with his parent company's compliance team for months and how their new audit procedures were specifically designed to catch exactly what he was doing. But here's the part that really broke him. I told him I also had copies of all his communications with Cheryl about their business plan. Every text about profit projections, every discussion about client lists she was building, every conversation about when they were going to launch their company using stolen inventory as startup capital. He tried to convince me that it wasn't really stealing because he was planning to pay the company back once his business took off. He actually said the words, paying it forward, like he was doing some kind of favor for his employer. When that didn't work, he switched to begging, saying he'd split the profits with me if I helped him make this go away. That's when I told him about the civil lawsuit his former employer was filing against him personally for recovery of stolen assets and about how they were also going after Cheryl as his business partner and my parents as his financial advisors. Everyone who'd helped him set up ProTech Solutions was going to be held liable for the damages. But the real kicker was when I explained that I'd been building my own consulting business for 2 years specifically to compete with whatever he was planning to launch. Every client contact Cheryl had been collecting through her job. I'd already reached out to them through professional channels and warned them about unethical vendors who might approach them with suspiciously cheap equipment. The medical practice where Cheryl worked was getting very interested in my suggestions about reviewing their vendor security protocols, especially after I mentioned concerns about employees who might be sharing confidential client information with outside parties. Nolan completely lost it at this point. He started screaming about how I was a pathetic loser who was jealous of his success, how I'd never amount to anything on my own, how this was all because I couldn't handle that Cheryl chose a real man over a warehouse worker. He threatened to sue me for industrial sabotage and defamation. I just laughed and told him he was welcome to try, But he might want to focus on finding a good criminal defense attorney first because the fraud charges were just getting started. The call with Cheryl was even better. She tried the innocent act first, crying about how she never meant for any of this to happen and how she was just trying to build a better future for Sky. She claimed she didn't really understand the business side of what Nolan was doing and thought everything was legitimate. But what really amazed me was how quickly she tried to throw Nolan under the bus once she realized how much trouble she was in. This woman who'd spent months planning to leave me for him suddenly started talking about how he'd pressured her into signing documents she didn't understand, and how she'd been afraid to question his business decisions because he had such a strong personality. She kept asking if there was any way to fix this, if maybe we could work together to make it all go away. She actually suggested that if I helped her get out of this mess, we could try marriage counseling and start fresh. Like, I was supposed to forget that she'd handed me divorce papers on Christmas morning while my 8-year-old daughter laughed at me. I walked her through every document I had with her signature on it, every business registration she'd signed as his partner, every bank account she'd helped him open, every client contact she'd illegally copied from her employer's database. I explained how conspiracy charges work and how her name was all over everything. She tried to blame Nolan, saying he'd manipulated her into helping him and she was just a victim in all of this. She actually had the nerve to say she still loved me and wanted to work things out if I could just help her fix this one mistake. That's when I told her about the conversations I'd had with her supervisor at the medical practice. Turns out they take patient privacy very seriously, and employees who share client information with unauthorized parties face immediate termination and potential legal action. Her boss was very interested to learn about Protect Solutions and Cheryl's role in building their client database. But what really destroyed her was when I explained that I'd been tracking her social media activity for months. Every post about business networking events she'd attended with Nolan, every photo of them together that she thought she'd hidden from me, every check-in at restaurants and hotels when she was supposed to be working late. I had a timeline of their entire relationship, complete with receipts and location data. Her employer was getting a very detailed report about her use of company time and resources for personal business development. The panic in her voice when I started reading specific dates and locations was satisfying in a way I can't even describe. All those times she told me she was working late or going to training seminars. I had GPS data showing her at romantic dinners with Nolan or business meetings for their fake company. All those client contacts she'd been building for their future business. I had screenshots of her accessing patient databases after hours and copying information to her personal devices. Her supervisor at the medical practice was very interested in these patterns, especially since several pharmaceutical companies had reported receiving unsolicited contact from someone claiming to have insider access to prescribing patterns and patient demographics. The conversation with my parents was the most satisfying because they tried to play the authority card. My father started lecturing me about family loyalty and how I was destroying relationships over a simple business misunderstanding. My mother chimed in about how disappointed they were in my vindictive behavior and how I needed to think about what this was doing to Sky. I let them finish their speeches, then asked if they wanted to explain their role in helping Nolan structure his fraud scheme to minimize tax liability. I read them excerpts from the business plan they'd helped him write, complete with revenue projections based on stolen inventory. The silence was incredible. Then my father tried to claim they were just providing general business advice and had no idea the inventory wasn't legitimate. So I reminded them about all those family meetings where they discussed my financial failures and how much better off everyone would be once Nolan took over supporting Cheryl and Sky. I told them their accounting firm was about to lose several major clients who weren't comfortable working with professionals who helped structure criminal enterprises. Amazing how fast word travels in professional circles when someone provides detailed documentation about ethical violations. See, what my parents never realized was that their little accounting firm depended heavily on referrals from other professionals in the area. When word got out that they'd been helping structure a business built on stolen inventory, suddenly other accountants, lawyers, and business consultants started questioning their judgment. I'd been very careful to share my concerns about Protect Solutions with several key people in the local business community, always framing it as general security awareness rather than specific accusations. But business owners talk, and when multiple people started mentioning that the same accounting firm had helped set up a company that was now under criminal investigation, patterns emerged. 3 of their biggest clients quietly moved their business elsewhere within the first week of January. 2 others requested detailed audits of all work my parents had done for them over the past year. My mother actually tried to guilt-trip me by saying I was destroying the family over money and pride. So, I explained that they'd already destroyed the family when they decided to help my brother steal from his employer and steal my wife while humiliating me in front of my daughter. But here's what none of them realized. Everything I'd done was completely legal. Every connection I'd made, every piece of information I'd shared, every business relationship I'd built was legitimate. I hadn't broken any laws or violated any professional standards. I'd just been better at playing their game than they were. The best part is that I'm not done yet. Tomorrow, I'll tell you guys about the final phase of my plan and how 6 years later, they're still dealing with the consequences of that Christmas morning. Final update. Alright guys, this is the conclusion you've all been waiting for. 6 years later, and every single one of them is still dealing with the consequences of that Christmas morning betrayal. Let me start with what happened to each of them over the years because the domino effect was absolutely beautiful to watch. Nolan got hit the hardest obviously. The criminal charges stuck: conspiracy to commit theft, fraud, filing false business documents. He spent 18 months in county jail and had to pay back over $60,000 in restitution to his former employer. His tech career was completely destroyed because word spread fast in the industry about why he was terminated. No reputable company would touch him after that. But here's the really satisfying part. His arrogance never went away. Even after everything collapsed, he kept insisting he was smarter than everyone else and that he'd been set up. He burned through 3 different defense attorneys because he kept trying to tell them how to do their jobs. During sentencing, he actually tried to represent himself for part of the hearing and argued that his theft was really innovative inventory management. The judge was not impressed. These days, he's working at a call center doing tech support for about $12 an hour. His supervisor is a 24-year-old kid with a community college degree who treats him like the failure he is. Every few months, he applies for management positions at various companies. But my consulting business has grown enough that I hear about most of the opportunities in the area. Amazing how a quick conversation about due diligence and background checking can help employers make informed decisions. Cheryl lost her job at the medical practice within 2 weeks of everything coming out. Turns out medical facilities take privacy violations extremely seriously, especially when there's evidence of systematic data theft for personal profit. She tried to fight the termination, but when they showed her the documentation of her after-hours database access and the client contacts she'd copied, her union rep basically told her to accept the severance package and disappear quietly. She's been working retail jobs ever since, mostly part-time, because her background checks keep flagging the privacy violations. She tried to go back to school for a career change, but student loan applications require employment verification, and her references from the medical practice are not exactly glowing. The divorce was finalized about 8 months after Christmas, and the custody arrangement was interesting. During all the legal proceedings, it came out that Sky wasn't actually my biological daughter. Something Cheryl had hidden from me for years. But here's the thing that nobody expected. I fought for joint custody anyway. Not because I wanted to hurt Cheryl, but because Sky was an innocent kid who'd been manipulated by adults into laughing at me during the worst moment of my life. She deserved better than being raised by people who taught her that betrayal and cruelty were acceptable family values. The conversations I had with Sky over the years were some of the most important of my life.